When you think of sci-fi, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Giant spaceships, giant lasers, giant worms? Come to think of it, why is everything giant in sci-fi? Well, if you thought about the former, it does make sense. These are the staples of the genre, and I think we can all agree that they're awesome. But, and correct me if I'm wrong here, the first thing you thought of probably wasn't empathy, religion, and 19th century British poetry. That is, unless you're a fan of Hyperion. Now, this is one of the most iconic sci-fi series out there, and on paper, it's completely insane. Imagine John Keats, the Terminator, a hard-boiled detective, and a baby all thrown together in a blender with philosophy, poetry, time travel, interstellar war, AI, and why not, literal gods. And yet, somehow Hyperion isn't just some chaotic madness. It's a textbook example of a story where the whole is so much greater than the sum of its parts. And no surprise then that it's built a massive fandom over the years. But despite its legendary status, it had a nightmare of a time when it came to adaptations, filled with twists, turns, and plenty of drama, including from the author himself. So in this video, I'm going to break down the sheer brilliance of Hyperion, its themes, world building, and wild ideas, its publishing history, its long and painful road with the adaptations, and finally where things stand today to answer the question, whatever happened to Hyperion? Hi everyone, my name is Otto and welcome to Exits Examined. We will be exploring series, franchises, and more after their prime time has seemingly come to an end. If that sounds good to you, there's a like and subscribe button below, and a huge, gigantic shout out to my patrons who make this channel possible. You guys truly rock. Okay, so if you ever try to summarize the Hyperion Cantos to a friend, you've probably realized it sounds like the setup to a terrible joke. A soldier, a priest, a diplomat, a detective, a baby, a poet, and just for fun, John Keats walk into a bar. Wait, whoops, sorry, I meant the time tombs. Except the punchline isn't some dad joke tier one-liner, it's chapters upon chapters of mind-melting revelations that will have you gripping your book with white knuckles, or more likely throwing it across the room in sheer existential hype. Now, it's easy to get ahead of yourself when talking about the Hyperion Cantos because there is just so much to it. Now, I'm usually hesitant to throw around the word masterpiece, but Hyperion is this massive, almost absurd collision of ideas, sci-fi, mythology, philosophy, horror, war, deeply personal character stories, all smashed together on top of themes of time, religion, empathy, AI, free will, love, war, spaceships, kidney stones, and of course, 19th century British poets. But somehow, with duct tape and super glue, Hyperion pulls it off and welds all these wildly different elements into something that actually works. And as you can probably imagine, there's nothing really else quite like it. So let's start from the top. The Cantos is a science fiction series by Dan Simmons, kicking off in 1989 and popping up on just about every greatest sci-fi novels of all time list for a reason. You'll often hear it described as something biblical, not just in heavy religious themes, but its sheer overwhelming scale. The first book is essentially a pilgrimage story in the same tradition as the Canterbury Tales, if the Canterbury Tales involves an interstellar suicide mission, an unstoppable murder machine, and a good amount of sex thrown in for good measure. The story begins with 7 travelers, each chosen for reasons they don't really understand, making their way to the planet of Hyperion. Their destination is the Time Tombs. Now, no one knows who built them or what their purpose is, but one thing is seemingly certain is that they're linked to the Shrike, a terrifying godlike entity that lurks in the valley, with its motives being as unknowable as the tombs themselves. Now, over the course of the first book, each of them shares their personal stories, and these are filled with some truly crazy twists and turns, which we'll talk about in a minute. But taking a step back at the wider universe, as is the grand tradition of all good science fiction, humanity has already gone and completely destroyed Earth. Now, some mad lad scientist, probably looking like Rick, thought it would be a great idea to create an artificial black hole, and well, you can imagine how well that turned out. With their homeworld gone, the remnants of humanity formed the hegemony of man, an empire stretching across more than 200 planets, held together by a technology called farcasting, which allows for instantaneous travel between worlds and was helped made by the Technocore, an alliance of artificial intelligences, and rather than pulling a Terminator, decided to ally with humanity, which is such a cool concept, right? And one of the things that Hyperion does brilliantly 180 is fleshing out its universe from wildly different perspectives, so the world building all feels really natural. You're not just seeing the world through the eyes of a lone hero or a single faction. The story is told through soldiers, diplomats, preachers, each bringing their own experiences and biases to the table, and the result is that the universe all just feels so lived in. Now, as you can imagine, this broad summary barely scratches the surface. The sheer number of factions, technologies, and concepts that Simmons throws into the mix is kind of staggering. And there are a ton of just cool sci-fi stuff in here, like tree ships, which are exactly what they sound like, and then there are the Ousters, a faction of humanity that chose to live in the outer edges of space and over the generations have become genetically different, evolving to survive in space. But world building, no matter how intricate or ambitious, is nothing without the people who are actually in it. The real magic, the icing if you will, and the thing that makes Hyperion not just impressive but unforgettable are of course its characters. And when it comes to a memorable, emotionally gut-punching protagonist, this series delivers some of the best in all of sci-fi. So here's who we got in this seemingly ragtag mishmash of random people. Father Hoyt, who is a priest who recounts the doomed mission of another priest. Father Paul Duray, whose journal recounts a disturbing and surreal encounter with a seemingly primitive group. Now, as his faith is tested in brutal ways through physical suffering and moments of pure existential horror, the story builds this incredible sense of mystery and discovery, and it actually took me a moment to warm up to this section, but the writing is just so well crafted, filled with this really visceral and unsettling imagery. There were just moments that really stuck with me, like the fasting priest who unconsciously started salivating at the scent of human flesh, which is just ugh. Or just listening to Duray's raw and conflicted thoughts about the people he's trying to convert, at one point describing them as, quote, a group of small retarded children, end quote. And then on top of that, there are just these beautiful reflections on death. Quote, all those before us have gone into the darkness without assurance of logic or fact or persuasive theory, with only a slender thread of hope or that all too shakable conviction of faith. And if they have been able to sustain that slim hope in the face of darkness, then so must I, end quote. Now, in a total 180 in tone, Colonel Kassad's story is way more action-packed and, dare I say, kind of rom-com. Okay, not actually, but that description is not far off. Now, Kassad is a soldier through and through, and his story is all about war and kind of like one big version of Hear Me Out, because it also has this eerie romance at its core. He keeps encountering the same mysterious woman across different battlefields across different times, and actually there's a really great description of Agincourt, which is not something I thought I would be saying while describing a sci-fi novel. In yet another 180, Martin Silenus is a poet with a wild, sometimes tragic, and sometimes hilarious arc. My guy has had a crazy life, at one point being an artist pouring his soul into masterpieces, only to end up mass-producing best-selling sci-fi pulp for cash. He's cynical, crude, and constantly walking the line between genius and self-destruction, and he's probably one of the most entertaining voices in the book, but beneath his sharp wit, there is a real sense of longing and just humanity here. And in another 180, Saul Weintraub is a scholar and father to his daughter Rachel, who contracts a condition that makes her age backwards, and he spends his journey desperately trying to find a way to save her day by day as she tragically ages backwards and slowly forgets her memories. His story is this really slow emotional gut punch, and if the line "see you later, alligator" doesn't break you by the end, I don't know what will. And in yet, you guessed it, another 180, Braun Lamia is a no-nonsense private detective, and her story is classic noir with murder intrigue and artificial intelligences pulling the strings. And then we got the consul, whose tale shifts tone again, but to avoid spoilers, I won't get into it too much. And that's just the main cast. There are some absolute bangers in the supporting lineup too, and honestly, I hesitate to even call them side characters because they're just as layered and compelling as the leads. Take Moneta, she's Kassad's frenemy, hot ex, Hear Me Out hookup. It's complicated, but she's objectively a fascinating character in her own right. And then there's CEO Gladstone, who runs the hegemony and might just be one of the best sci-fi leaders ever written. By the time these second books roll around and everything starts hitting the fan, she has some absolutely killer moments, and if civilization was crumbling around me, which doesn't sound too far off, she is the kind of leader I'd want calling the shots. Oh yeah, and don't for a second think I forgot John Keats. Yes, that John Keats, the 19th century English poet. And if that sounds completely insane, well, you're right, but trust me, it does work, and I'll get to him soon. So, taking a step back, at first glance, all of these stories feel completely disconnected, like someone just grabbed a bunch of random sci-fi novels, stapled them together, and called it a day. But there is one thing tying them all together: Hyperion, and more importantly, the Shrike, who's at the center of everything. Now, the Shrike is the face of the series for good reason. It's one of the most terrifying, mysterious, and flat-out awesome sci-fi antagonists ever written. This thing is absolute nightmare fuel given form, all spikes, razor wire, and time-warping horror. And it also has a penchant for putting its victims on the delightfully named Tree of Pain, which first of all sounds like the name of the most metal bands ever, and second is exactly what it sounds like: an enormous, nightmarish, metallic tree filled with countless writhing and agonized human victims. Now, the Shrike's origins are originally very mysterious. Some people fear it, some people hate it, and some people straight up worship it. Now, the Shrike's portrayal shifts a lot in the later books, and I won't lie, I kind of miss the raw and noble menace when it first appears, but even then, it's still one of the coolest sci-fi villains ever put to page. Okay, so heads up, spoiler warning from here on out, all the way until the writing and development section, and as you might guess, there are some absolute spoilers, like the fate of the universe level spoilers, so don't say I didn't warn you. So what this all leads to, and basically the best way I've seen it summed up, in a beautifully simple way, is that the Cantos is essentially about a cyborg who bangs a hot detective in order to save the galaxy from AI God that sent a Terminator back in time to hunt down Jesus. Simple, right? Now, in more exact terms, basically by the end of the first book, the Pilgrims have all told their story and just arrived at the time tubes. But by the time of the second book, to do something I absolutely love and break down an absurdly long and detailed plot, things escalate extremely fast. What starts as a seemingly straightforward war between the hegemony and the ousters turns into something far more complex. Essentially, the hegemony, who we all thought were the civilization/good guys, sent most of their fleet to Hyperion, only for them to be Admiral Akbar, because turns out the ousters have outmaneuvered them and are now attacking the homeworlds. And it all looks like the start of an Armageddon party. Now, all of this gets turned on its head when the ousters, who were initially presented as spacefaring barbarians, turned out to be an advanced, peace-like, diverse civilization, and they aren't the real enemy. Instead, it's the AI Technocore pulling the strings, which, surprise, surprise, has been manipulating humanity for centuries. And it all eventually becomes clear that there's actually an even greater war going on between two actual gods, one machine and one human. Yep, because it turns out that God is real, or gods are real. So basically, the Technocore has been trying to make a machine god, which honestly, has that ever gone well for anyone in science fiction? Anyway, eventually they make one far in the future, and that god has been sending the messages back from the future, and in this future, it's battling another god, which is apparently human god, and the empathy part of that god has fled back in time to the current day with the Shrike sent to kill it. Crazy stuff, right? And it might sound all way too much, but I promise it comes together pretty well. And don't for a second think this is all heavy-handed, essay-like exposition. This is all given in very human ways with some really incredible moments thrown in here. Now, some real standout moments for me from the first two books was when Cassad is banging Moneta, business as usual, but then she turns into the Shrike mid-coitus, which has to be the mother of all morning afters. Or when Braun Lamia, after this all-knowing massive AI god kills her boyfriend, basically essentially says, "You're a nerd loser." And then, of course, there's John Keats. The Cantos are packed with Keats references, from the book title itself to actual quotes, to the fact that there are literal reincarnated versions of John Keats running around as major characters. Simmons doesn't just reference him, he makes Keats's ideas central to the fabric of the story. Now, personally, I was never a huge poetry person, but reading some Keats for this video actually made me really get into it. If you've never checked out his work, I'd highly recommend flipping through some of his quotes. There's something really deeply and achingly human about them, and I think it's no coincidence that the Cantos is, at its core, also deeply human as well. But if all of that is too much nerd stuff for you, and if you're looking for a literal, all-out, throw everything at the wall finale, the Cantos delivers. There's this huge war, a war of faith, personal duels, and a literal battle between gods. There's an army of Shrikes, Cassad going full Rambo and charging into battle against them, and it all just feels like incredible moment after incredible moment. Now, Simmons isn't just throwing big ideas at you for the sake of it, you really get the feeling that he's building towards something. Every twist, every philosophical detour in the Cantos isn't just there to look look cool, although it does look cool. It's all part of a bigger conversation, and at the heart of this conversation is more often than not religion. The Cantos treats these massive cosmic questions, free will, destiny, love, suffering, the way that myth and theology do. This isn't just sci-fi with religious references sprinkled in for flavor, it's a fundamental exploration of the nature of God and humanity's relation to it. And that obsession extends to and is explored with AI. Quote, "The Technocore wasn't some Frankenstein artificial intelligence that broke its shackles. It was, as are we, the results of evolution, of actual artificial life, bits of replicated, eating, killing computer code that already exist and which got loose in the primordial soup, the World Wide Web. We have created artificial life. It has escaped our control. It is evolving in ways we can't imagine or predict. In that sense, perhaps all creation turns on their creators. Nothing is a real creation unless it has the autonomy and ability to do things undreamed of by its designers." End quote. And if that doesn't seem relevant in today's world, well, I don't know what does. And that's the thing about the Cantos. It's not just a sci-fi story. It's grappling with the biggest questions imaginable: the nature of God, the meaning of evil, the essence of humanity, the power of poetry, the supremacy of love, the pain of betrayal, and the destiny of the human race, and the battle for free will. These aren't just sci-fi ideas. They're the same massive existential themes that have been central to literature for centuries. And it is no surprise that the Cantos gets compared to Dante's Divine Comedy. And honestly, it doesn't feel off, just with more AI, time travel, and of course, giant hype space battles. Now, these big themes, the ambition, the sheer scope is wrapped in some truly beautiful writing. Simmons himself described the tone as trying to have that Jack Vance openness mixed with cyberpunk edge, and yet it's also got this epic mythic feel, with Simmons saying that he wanted to capture the feeling of the American edition's Cantos cover, which some people have criticized the Shrike's appearance here. You know, it's kind of meant to be this cosmic time traveling machine, but it does look a little like it's trying too hard to be an early 2000s edgelord. But the feeling of the painting really does capture the heart of Hyperion perfectly: a vast, windswept landscape, an ominous but beautiful sunset, and the Shrike standing in the foreground ominously. And it really nails that vastness, the loneliness, and the sense of impending doom that the Cantos is all about. And of course, what sets the Cantos apart as far as its writing is the literary depth in here. Simmons was openly drawing on the work of huge swaths of historical literature, and of course John Keats, whose influence is baked in the very DNA of the story. So who could have written a series this ambitious, this sprawling, and this massive on nearly every level? Well, as you might guess, Dan Simmons is an interesting guy. Before becoming a full-time writer in 1987, he was a public school teacher, and since then he's written just about every genre you can think of: detective stories, horror, historical fiction, sci-fi. And if you've ever checked out his interviews, one thing is immediately obvious: the man lives and breathes literature. He's not just a sci-fi guy or horror guy, he's a writer in a broader sense. And he once said, quote, "Anyone who spends his or her life reading inside just one genre is an idiot," end quote. And if the Cantos is anything to measure that on, the man lives what he preaches. Of course, like seemingly all longtime authors, Simmons has had his share of controversy. He's got some, let's call them hot takes on politics and current events. For one, he's definitely not Greta's biggest fan, and he's also had some strong opinions about Barack Obama, so much so that he wrote an entire dystopian novel, Flashback, imagining a future America ruined by Obama-era policies, so make of that what you will. These days, Simmons has more or less disappeared from social media, possibly because of said hot takes, but if you're morbidly curious, his old website, which you can still find on the Wayback Machine, is a fascinating rabbit hole. He's had a lot to say about the Vietnam War Memorial, about poetry, about the art of writing itself, so if you're bored on a Sunday night with a whiskey in hand, I would highly recommend checking it out. If nothing else, you get to see those lovely early 2000s-esque era blogs. They just don't make them like they used to. So if you're anything like me, some of your books may be, well, let's just say well-loved, with some not-so-glamorous coffee stains. Hey, it happens, but why not treat yourself and your poor, battered books to something that will keep them cozy and protected? Well, that's where today's sponsor, Book Beau, comes in. They make gorgeous book sleeves that aren't just about protection, they also look amazing too. And it's actually not just for books, whether you're toting around a Kindle, iPad, or even a Switch, they got you covered. With my personal favorite probably being the Game Boy inspired sleeve, because come on, you gotta represent. They even got reading pillows if you want to be super comfy. Now, one of the best things about this channel is getting to shout out small businesses who actually care about reading and also their products and their customers, and I'm really excited to support these folks. So go ahead, treat yourself and your books to something nice, and check out Book Beau using the code below, which is ExitsExamined10, to get a nice 10% off your order and keep those pages pristine in style. Again, Exits10 tin to get a nice comfy 10% off your next order. Alright, back to the video. So, as far as what actually makes up this series, it's actually extremely manageable, almost deceptively so. Or maybe I'm just jaded from series like Ender's Game or Dragonlance, where the books, sub-series, spin-offs, and whatever else never seems to end. But here, it's simple stuff, my hegemony chum. 4 books total, and these can be split into 2 sub-arcs, or duologies, whatever you want to call them. First up, we got Hyperion in 1989. Now, the first book is famous for its Canterbury Tales structure, and then there's the Fall of Hyperion in 1990, and oh man, what a ride. The format shifts completely from the first book. New structure, new perspectives, new POV characters, and it took me a while to get into, but once I did, it went off. We're talking deep philosophical themes, sky-high stakes, characters getting pushed to their absolute limit, and this book is the definition of escalating tension. Interestingly enough, Simmons has said he doesn't really think of these books as separate books, but rather as one continuous story, and this was originally supposed to be just one single book, but you know, publishers love that sweet, sweet money. So my point is you have to read the Hyperion and the Fall of Hyperion together. They're 2 halves of the same whole. Now, the second duology is Endymion in 1996 and the Rise of Endymion in 1997, and yeah, you may notice a pattern in the naming conventions here. Now, these books are different. They're set hundreds of years after the events of the first books in a universe where the Catholic Church pretty much owns everything. Now, while it's mostly a new story, a lot of themes, ideas, and plot points from the first 2 books carry over, and of course, our boy, the Shrike, is back, but this time he's kind of part of the gang. The story follows Rawl, a former shepherd and convicted murderer because someone killed his dog, which, John Wick, is that you? Anyway, Rawl is recruited by none other than the absolute mad lad Silenus, who's still kicking around, to protect Ainea, who is a very special girl. The world building here is both familiar and totally different thanks to the fallout from the first books. And there's a solid dynamic between the main characters, but some people have understandably felt a bit weird about Rawl and Aiena's dynamic because they have a bit of an age difference, to put it mildly. Now, obviously, with all the sci-fi wackiness going on here, it's more complicated than that, but also he calls her kiddo and definitely rubs some people the wrong way. I don't know, some people care, some people don't. But on top of that, there are also some contradictions and hard retcons from the first books, and a whole subplot involving kidney stones for good measure. Now, people have opinions about this duology. Some think it's slightly weaker than Hyperion, others say it feels more like fanfiction, and some say it's better. It does feel different. It's more of a world-hopping space adventure, which is a cool way to see more of the universe, even if the tone shifts a bit. But hey, it also features one of the most hype fight scenes in the entire series, so there is that. And as a fun fact, there are 4 books in the series, just like there are 4 points to a crucifix, and I thought that was a really nice touch. Because, by the way, those feature heavily in the story. Now, as far as reading order, this one is easy. Just read it in order. Done. If you really want to be an edgelord, you could start with the second duology, and you wouldn't be completely lost since it kind of acts as a reset. But honestly, at the very least, you need to start each duology at its first book. No skipping around, chronological order is the way to go. Now, if you've made it through all 4 books and you still want more, you're in luck. There are a few short stories that expand the universe in some interesting ways. They're not like essential reading, but if you're craving more of Simmons' world, they're worth checking out. We got Remembering Ciri in 1983, but this one is essentially the consul's tale from Hyperion, included almost verbatim in the first novel. We also got The Death of Centaur in 1990, which is set on Hyperion. You can find it online and I'll link it below. While it takes place in the universe, it doesn't really have that much connection to the main plot beyond a few mentions. Finally, we got Orphans of the Helix in 1999. If the previous 2 felt a bit insubstantial, Helix is the meatiest of the bunch, I guess. It's set over 481 years after the end of the last novel. It's a short but dense story, about 40 pages, that continues the themes and threads from the main books, and it does pack a lot into a small space. More importantly, our boy the Shrike is back. And without spoiling too much, let me just quote the Wikipedia summary here. Quote, "The Shrike is used as a method of locomotion," end quote, which is a phrase I never thought I'd read, but I love. Okay, so one of the most epic, far-reaching, and thought-provoking sci-fi series of all time, and on top of that, it's been around for 30 plus years. So you would think this thing has got some adaptations, but for better or worse, out of almost all the major series I've covered, there's been pretty much nothing out there over the years, which is kind of surprising given how rich the world building is here. You'd think there'd be some type of board game, comic, even a musical out there, right? But there's been nothing, although it's not been for lack of trying. oh no, Hollywood has tried and failed repeatedly. Now, the earliest mention I could dig up of a movie comes from the early 2000s when Dan Simmons himself said he had sold the rights to a quote-unquote major studio. He even heavily implied that Leonardo DiCaprio was attached, which honestly is kind of awesome. Can you imagine a 2000s DiCaprio running from the strike? Unfortunately, nothing ever came from it. Now, fast forward to 2010, and we actually got some concrete news. Warner Bros. Had picked the rights, and the plan was to combine Hyperion and the Fall of Hyperion into one film. Now, if you've read those books, you will already see a huge problem. That is like mashing the Lord of the Rings into a single movie, except every character has their own entirely different genre of storytelling, which, yeah, it's not happening, and indeed, it did not happen. But Hollywood wasn't done yet. In a bizarre twist, Sci-Fi announced they were turning Hyperion into a TV miniseries with Bradley Cooper as a producer. Now, at first, Cooper seemingly wanted a movie, then a miniseries, and then plot twist, by 2021, he was back to wanting a movie. However, it looks like through all the twisty and turny navigations of what can probably be described as textbook production hell, to add fuel to the dumpster fire, Simmons apparently was left out of the loop with a forum post back in the mid-2010s where he apparently said, quote, "At no time during this actor plays with his toys joke did Cooper ever contact the author of the novel he said meant so much to him. I've been around the LA industry just long enough to know, deep in my marrow, that going to the novelist for a film is a ludicrous and preposterous idea," end quote. So yeah, not exactly a ringing endorsement. The most recent update is still from a 2021 announcement, with Cooper still developing Hyperion as a movie under his new production banner, and it's supposedly still happening. It's just not moving very fast. But maybe it's for the better, because you'll see time and time again in comments that it would be difficult film to adapt, although Simmons himself seemed philosophically hopeful. Quote, "The key is not in translating the book to the screen, that's almost always doomed, but in finding the proper cinematic equivalent. If the movie is actually made, I will do my best to get the writers and makers to deconstruct the long tail and reassemble it in a new form to make the best motion picture it can be, while being faithful only to the essence of the book's themes and more important characters. What the literary SF community has been waiting for a long time is a major SF film that will honor its literary precursor with the skill and love that Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings trilogy has done for the Tolkien epic. But hey, with the huge success of Dune, there is hope for more smart, ambitious sci-fi adaptations. And if nothing else, a high-profile movie could get more people to read the books, which would be a win in itself. Or with anime adaptations seemingly getting more popular now, I would 100% give a Hyperion animatrix / Canterbury Tales hybrid the benefit of the doubt. Now, if the movies seem hard to pull off, a game might be even harder. There was actually a petition I found at one point for Bethesda, yes, that Bethesda, to adapt Hyperion into an RPG, and it got about 100 signatures. Given Starfield's reception, maybe that was for the best. Now still, if you're itching for a Hyperion-style sci-fi strategy, you can always play Stellaris and roleplay as the Technocore. It's not quite the same, but hey, we take what we can get. So what is the future of the series looking like? Well, Simmons himself has been pretty adamant that there will not be any more books. Quote, "Since I hate endless sequels that provide diminishing returns for the readers, I've vowed that these will be the last novels ever set in the Hyperion universe," end quote. But it's still definitely not out of the realm of possibility for there to be more media, either film or otherwise, at least sometimes in the future, especially since the film hasn't been ruled out yet. As far as Simmons himself, he's still actively writing, but he seems to have moved on from the universe. Instead, he's been busy writing historical fiction, horror, and thrillers. But if you're a fan of the Hyperion books, Simmons has written other sci-fi books, which are apparently great, but different. And even without new content, the Hyperion fandom has remained strong. There's been some absolutely incredible fan art that perfectly captures the tone and scale of the series. One standout artist, Silo, has created a staggering amount of Hyperion-inspired work, which I'll link below, and they agreed to let me use a huge number of their works for this video, so enormous thank you to that. Another artist, Alex Rise, made an amazing illustration of the Colonel's fight, which I would love to have one day hanging on my wall. Beyond artwork, there's been an outpouring of fan love in all kinds of ways, fan-made maps to tattoos. And if you know any other fan projects out there, please drop them in the comments. I'd love to feature them in the description. And it really does seem like Hyperion has cemented its place in sci-fi history. You'll find it on nearly every best sci-fi books of all time list, and the love for it has not faded. Maybe it's not a tidal wave of hype, but the passion is still very much alive. So we inevitably get to the question of why? Well, I think at the heart, beneath all those layers of flashy AI, spaceships, and kids smashing their favorite sci-fi toys together, the real magic of Hyperion is that it uses those big set pieces and high concept ideas as springboards to explore deeply human themes. Empathy, religion, fate, even poetry. Now, you'd think at first glance that all of these would be polar opposites, but Simmons manages to merge the two and show that these two very different mediums can be totally different but still be used to talk about the same deeply human things. And if you wrap that on top of some truly great and beautiful writing, fascinating world building, and one of the greatest sci-fi villains of all time, you get Hyperion. So in conclusion, no matter what time you're in, past, present, or future, keep one eye out behind you for that dastardly Shrike. And in your next election, don't forget to vote Gladstone. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all the help and support, and another huge shout out to my patrons who keep this channel alive. If you guys want to find out more ways to support me and check out my Patreon, you can check out a link to it below. Once you're a member, you can get access to the Discord, where you can chat, hang out, or yell at me, whatever you want to do. As always, if you ever have any suggestions about what you want me to cover next, please drop a comment. It's always really cool to hear what you guys have to say. Anyway, thanks so much. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.